I had barely set foot into my parents' grand dining room when I felt it, the sharp edge of dismissal slicing through the air. My children, bright-eyed and hopeful, were handed plates that looked like afterthoughts, while my cousins' kids were served silver platters heaped with everything a child could dream of. I forced a smile, but inside, my chest tightened. "Here, sweethearts, just a little for you," my mother said, sliding their plates toward them like scraps. The words stung more than the cold soup they received. I caught my son's confused glance and my daughter's disappointed frown, and my stomach churned with anger I had learned to bury. I remembered every other family gathering where we were invisible, ignored, the perpetual understudies in their theatre of privilege. I clenched my fists under the table, promising myself silently that this would change. No one would ever underestimate us again, not while I still drew breath. This was only the beginning. The game had just started. Even as I watched my children get overlooked, I couldn't escape the memories of my own childhood, the years etched into my bones with the same sting of favoritism. My older sister always seemed to glide through life effortlessly, praised for grades I had earned with blood, sweat, and tears. Every science fair trophy I carried home was met with a polite nod, while her smallest accomplishments were broadcast to family and neighbours like royal announcements. Birthday parties blurred together, mine always smaller, cheaper, or forgotten entirely. I remember standing in the living room once holding a painting I had poured my soul into, and my mother dismissing it as nice but not as good as your sister's. The humiliation settled over me like a thick fog, teaching me to swallow my pride, to speak softly and avoid attention. And yet, every slight, every overlooked victory ignited a quiet determination within me, a fire I buried for years. Now, watching history repeat with my own children, I realized I would never let it continue. The moment we stepped into the garden, it felt like walking onto another planet. Everywhere I looked, my family flaunted their wealth with an ease that made my chest tighten. My cousin's husband arrived in a sleek black sports car, the kind that cost more than our entire apartment. The children wore designer outfits that gleamed under the chandelier lights, while my kids' simple clothes made them stick out like punctuation in the wrong sentence. Platters of imported delicacies circled the room, and champagne flowed like water, though none of it was ours to touch. I felt the familiar knot of resentment tighten in my stomach, not just for myself, but for my children, forced to stand on the outskirts of indulgence. I couldn't help comparing our careful, modest life with this gilded display, noticing every deliberate exclusion and unspoken hierarchy. The contrast was painful, but it lit a spark inside me. They saw us as lesser, but that perception would not last. Soon they would realize exactly who they had underestimated. My daughter's eyes flicked toward the table, lingering on the towering cake and colorful platters reserved for her cousins. "Mum, why don't we get anything like that?" she whispered, her voice trembling just enough to cut through my composure. I swallowed hard, forcing a reassuring smile. "It's just a small plate, sweetie. We'll enjoy what we have," I murmured, though the words felt hollow even to me. My son poked at his meager serving of chicken, glancing toward his cousin who was being fed bite after bite by a nanny. "They got the big one," he muttered under his breath. My husband's attempts at consolation fell flat. I could see my own parents exchanging amused looks, clearly enjoying the display of our subordination. The weight of guilt pressed on me, remembering every time I had silently endured this same humiliation. I clenched my fists under the table, heart racing, determination building. I would not let this continue. Not for them, not for me. Something had to change, and I knew exactly what. That night, after tucking my children into bed, I sat alone in the quiet of our living room, the weight of the day pressing on my shoulders. I went over every slight, every smirk, every glance that said we were beneath them. But instead of anger, I let a slow, simmering determination take root. I began mapping out possibilities, Small, careful moves that could tilt the scales without drawing immediate attention. A legal detail here, a strategic investment there, connections quietly nurtured over months. Each idea was measured, deliberate, never impulsive. I imagined moments where I could subtly remind them of my competence, of the intelligence and resourcefulness they had always dismissed. Every time I pictured a small victory, my confidence grew. It wasn't about revenge for the sake of cruelty. It was about reclaiming dignity, about showing my children and myself that we were not powerless. And though the path was slow, I could already see the first cracks forming in their sense of superiority. It started almost imperceptibly, like a quiet ripple before a wave. At my cousin's charity gala, I noticed her carefully polished image faltering. Her speech stumbled over rehearsed lines, and a spilled glass of wine left a bright stain across her designer dress. The room murmured with polite amusement, but the embarrassment was real, and I felt a flicker of satisfaction I hadn't expected. Then came the missed invitations, the overlooked connections, the subtle snubs from people who had once fawned over her. Every misstep, no matter how small, was magnified against the backdrop of her inflated sense of perfection. I watched from a distance, heart pounding, aware of the delicate balance between pleasure and restraint. These were not grand public humiliations yet, but they were seeds, planting the beginnings of a reversal I had long envisioned. The arrogance that had always shielded her was cracking, and with each subtle mishap, I felt the tension building toward the moment when it would all finally unravel. For the first time, the quiet determination I had cultivated wavered. Late at night, I questioned whether I was overreaching, whether the careful moves I had planned could ever topple a family so entrenched in wealth and influence. Every memory of their laughter at my children's expense, every whispered insult I had endured, rose to the surface, making the path forward feel impossibly steep. And then came the subtle attacks, calls questioning my decisions, gossip that tried to undermine my reputation, even a cousin deliberately spreading misinformation to make me appear incompetent. My confidence shook, my resolve tested like never before. Yet, despite the fear and isolation, I could not stop. I remembered the countless times my children had looked to me for protection, for guidance, and I drew strength from them. The stakes had never been higher, and I knew that if I faltered now, the chance for justice would slip through my fingers. I couldn't fail. Not this time. I started quietly reaching out to allies I had once underestimated, building a network of people who could help turn the tide without drawing attention. Conversations over coffee, discreet messages, and carefully timed calls became my arsenal. Each connection was a piece of the puzzle, each carefully whispered suggestion a potential lever to shift the balance in my favor. I negotiated small advantages, secured legal advice, and made financial moves that seemed innocuous, but positioned me strategically for what was coming. My family remained oblivious, still confident in their superiority, while I quietly gathered momentum. In one tense exchange, I confronted a distant relative who had once mocked my ambitions, turning their skepticism into a reluctant ally. Every small victory fueled my determination, each maneuver a proof of my capability. I felt a quiet thrill as the first real signs of leverage appeared, the faint tremor of change beneath the polished surface of their arrogance. The night of the gala arrived, and I walked in with a calm that belied the storm brewing beneath the surface. My cousins were in their usual element, preening and basking in admiration, completely unaware of the subtle shifts I had orchestrated over months. As the evening unfolded, the first cracks began to show. A business opportunity they had counted on slipped through their fingers because I had quietly positioned myself as the indispensable intermediary. Their polite smiles faltered, confusion and frustration replacing confidence. A few whispered comments reached my ears, laced with disbelief, as they realized I was no longer the powerless outsider they had dismissed. Watching their reactions, I felt a surge of vindication and satisfaction I had never allowed myself before. The room seemed to hold its breath, as if sensing the quiet power reversal taking place. For the first time, they tasted the uncertainty they had long imposed on others, and I savoured every second. Later that evening, I found myself alone with my aunt, the one who had always positioned herself as the family's moral arbiter while quietly undermining me at every turn. Her eyes narrowed as she realised the shift in power, subtle yet undeniable. "I don't know what you think you're doing," she said, her voice trembling between anger and disbelief. I met her gaze steadily, letting the weight of years of neglect and favoritism settle between us. "I'm doing what I should have done a long time ago," I replied calmly. Every word was measured, every pause deliberate. She tried to deflect, to manipulate, but I had anticipated every argument, every attempt at guilt. As the conversation unfolded, I could feel the balance tipping. I wasn't just confronting her, I was showing her the moral consequences of her actions. Her frustration grew, matched by the quiet satisfaction building inside me. For the first time, she truly understood the impact of her cruelty, and I felt a sense of karmic justice wash over me. The next morning, news began to trickle in like a slow-moving avalanche. Deals my cousins had counted on fell apart, investments collapsed, and their carefully curated social image started to crumble. A high-profile business partner pulled out at the last minute, leaving them scrambling in front of peers who had once fawned over their every move. Invitations were rescinded, social favours evaporated, and whispered gossip spread through the elite circles like wildfire. My children watched wide-eyed as the cousins who had laughed at their modest lives now faced the consequences of arrogance and entitlement. My son whispered, "Did they get what they deserved?" And I nodded, feeling a swelling pride. Every carefully orchestrated move, every patient strategy culminated in this moment. The luxury that had once overshadowed our lives collapsed around them, exposing vulnerability, ignorance, and moral failure. The reversal was complete. The family that had long held power over us now trembled before the consequences of their own actions. That evening, as we returned home, the weight of the day settled over me in a way that was both exhausting and liberating. I looked at my children, their eyes bright with understanding, and realized how far we had come, not just in status or recognition, but in self-respect and resilience. They had witnessed firsthand that patience, intelligence, and integrity could turn even the harshest injustice into a lesson in strength. I thought back on the years of being overlooked, the constant comparisons, the subtle humiliations, and felt a deep sense of closure. The family gatherings that once filled me with dread now felt like chapters I had survived and mastered. I allowed myself a quiet smile, knowing we had reclaimed our dignity without sacrificing who we were. Though not every wound was healed, and some relationships remained fractured, the balance had shifted. For the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, and my children understood the value of standing tall even when the world tries to dismiss you. Months later, life had settled into a new rhythm. My children thrived at school, their confidence growing with every achievement, free from the shadow of favoritism. The antagonists, once untouchable, struggled to regain footing. Their social circles whispered, opportunities vanished, and their arrogance had been replaced by caution. Meanwhile, our small victories compounded quietly: financial stability, newfound respect, and subtle influence we had never claimed before. I watched my children play in the garden, laughing without worry, and felt a deep sense of pride and relief. The world had shifted beneath their cousins' feet, but ours had risen steadily, grounded in patience and resilience. Though the journey had been long and painful, we had emerged stronger, wiser, and quietly empowered. And for the first time, I allowed myself to savor the calm triumph of justice finally realized. Sitting quietly that evening, I reflected on everything that had unfolded. The years of being overlooked, the subtle humiliations, the careful planning that finally turned the tables. It wasn't wealth or status alone that mattered, but the integrity and patience that guided every choice. My children had learned more than victory. They had learned that dignity, cleverness, and moral courage could outlast arrogance and entitlement. I whispered to them, "Never let anyone tell you who you are worth or who you should be. Power isn't given. It's earned through patience, intelligence, and heart." The family that once towered over us now faced the consequences of their pride, and the satisfaction of that karmic justice was deeply sweet. As I watched my children drift to sleep, I felt an unshakable sense of closure. Life had balanced itself, and our triumph, quiet yet undeniable, left a lasting mark on all of us.